Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic 10 Tips to Improve Your Wildlife and Nature Photography, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Charlie Reinertsen. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you for being here with us today. Over to you, Charlie.
Thanks for the introduction, Rob, and thanks to everyone for joining today. I'm really excited to share some of my own tips that I've gathered from other photographers as well as just from having time in the field. And just to give you a quick overview of what we'll do today, I'll share a little bit of my background and how I got into photography and how I use it in my career. And then we'll dive right into a lot of information about whether it's technical details for how to use your equipment or whether it's tips for how to be more observant or paying attention to different things in the field to try and maximize the chance for getting the photo that you're really hoping for. It'll be geared kind of a mix between wildlife photography and then landscape photography. And we'll use case studies of certain pictures that I've worked on or assignments that I've been on and use those as jumping off points for the conversation. And then be sure to save your questions or submit them as you have them. And I'll save a good amount of time at the end for specific questions as they come up. But my path to photography really started as a biology student. So I was researching softshell turtles in the field in the Mississippi River. I went to school in Minnesota, and during that time, I was documenting my work. So just with a point and shoot camera. And then I started to take photography classes and I was starting to use a DSLR and also some film photography as well. And I just thought that all of these creatures that I was meeting through doing this field research were really charismatic. And I was trying to capture these animals in their ecosystems and try and get some of their personality coming through. So this is a smooth softshell turtle, an aquatic turtle that lives in the Mississippi River. And this is a big cast of characters of turtles and frogs that I was hanging out with that summer. And I just really started to get drawn into how do you make an image that gives someone a feeling or maybe inspires, hopefully, people to learn more about these incredible creatures that we share this earth with. And so that really started to get me thinking about, okay, I love science, but I also love communications. And that spurred me to uh, work in photography and writing and ultimately go into science communications over the last 10 years. Uh, Everything from designing and developing exhibits that talk about climate solutions to writing for magazines and developing websites. And it's brought me to some really incredible places all over the world. I've had, really great luck and fortune to work for companies like Natural Habitat Adventures and World Wildlife Fund to be able to try and capture this amazing planet that we live on and to be able to try and inspire more conservation for our natural resources. Uh, and right now, I'm guiding a few different trips for Natural Habitat Adventures just a couple times a year. One of them is in Yellowstone and Grand Teton, and a lot of the pictures today will be from that area. I lived and worked there for a number of years, and the next trip that I have there is actually in September, so September 5th. I'll be guiding there, and I also guide in Michoacan, Mexico for the monarch butterfly migration as well as in the canyons location in Grand Canyon and a number of different national parks in that area. So it's just an incredible opportunity. A lot of my work in science communications is almost a step removed from getting to actually, like this, talk to people and share my work in a more personal way. A lot of my work is through writing and video. And so these trips with Natural Habitat Adventures to be able to connect with guests and bring them to these incredible places and share my love for these places is one of the highlights of the year. And the rest of the time, I run a consulting business, Two Line Studio, offering science communications and photography and video to a number of different clients. And today, we're going to focus on the photography side of things. I've done a couple other webinars about video settings and different things to consider in that arena, but today is really going to be focused on photography. So just to give you a quick overview of what we're covering, these are kind of the categories that we'll talk about, and every one of these categories is going to have some overlap. So we'll kind of look at a case study for each of them, but I'll be touching on all of these topics throughout. So number one, and this is the biggest tip, is knowing your wildlife ecology. If you're hoping to get pictures of animals, you need to know them, know their habitats, know their behaviors so that you can set yourself up for the best possible position. The next one, using depth of field to your advantage and kind of using that as one of the tools in your kit that you're always thinking about, of thinking, do I want really shallow depth of field, or do I want to have everything in focus, and different ways to kind of stretch your thinking about how you're using that tool. The next one, when to use and when to ditch your tripod. I'll talk about my experience with tripods and when I find that they're really useful and when I find that they're too heavy to carry in the backcountry and you might not need them. Next, kind of related to that, is what to bring and when it comes to gear. Maybe you've got a small kit and this isn't a consideration, but once you start building more lenses and different filters and different tools that you can use to help capture what you're looking for, we'll just talk about some of the trade-offs there and how to maximize your gear if you're trying to travel light for whatever reason. And then trying to break habits. That's one of the biggest kind of areas that I've seen where when I'm not being very creative, I'm just sitting back in my go-to camera settings and I'm not pushing myself to think about all of the tools that you have at your disposal, because really a camera is just infinite number of possibilities for composition and for the technical side of things to be adjusted. And so trying to maintain the playfulness as you are photographing your subjects. And then thinking of encouraging folks to tell the whole story. I think this one's really important. So often, we look for that one shot that's just this beautiful profile of a wolf, right up close. And the reality is sometimes that shot is not accessible depending on your gear. Or you just need a good amount of luck and time in the field to be able to get that shot. So how do you make sure that maybe you have a goal for a certain image, but what are all the other images that you want to get while you're working towards that goal so that you can show a more comprehensive story of that wildlife or that particular spot in the world? Next one, some of these are just adages, but they really apply. Practice makes perfect, just iterations, thinking about ways to take a picture and then modify one thing or return to the same place over and over. And another one that's really important that sometimes we lose sight of as photographers is putting the camera down. And finally, every edit counts. So just taking a quick peek, I've done some webinars about my workflow and how I edit photos. We're not going to go extensively into that, but we're going to talk about some of the key things that can really take your photo from a good photo to a great photo in post-production. And finally, we're going to take a look at learn from the pros. So who are the photographers that you look up to? What is it about their work that you're really drawn to? And trying to distill that and learn from that. Those are the key portions that we'll move through today. So just starting off, this is first because it's number one. If you're interested in trying to capture wildlife in your image, you have to know your wildlife ecology. You have to learn about these animals. You have to immerse yourself in their diet, in their habits, what they're doing when, and then you need to think about how you're going to position yourself or get into an area to be able to photograph them. Whether that's thinking about time of year or time of day, There are so many factors, and the best thing that you can do to equip yourself is to really understand deeply the area that you're photographing. And so the case study that I thought of here, I was on a wolf watching tour. This was actually with college students, and I was guiding at the time. And we were up in Yellowstone National Park, and our goal was to be able to see wolves. And so we were really gearing our itinerary of how we were spending our time around trying to see those creatures. And so these animals, wolf ecology, they are crepuscular. They're active at dawn and dusk. So you have to match your day to be able to really emphasize that time of day. And getting out there before first light, and then being in areas where you hope wolves will be, and having all the right equipment to be able to scan and look for them in these areas. These, wolf packs cover really big territories, and so it's important to pay attention to prey species like bison and pronghorn, and looking at those big herds across the landscape, you can start to watch and see what their behaviors are. If they're all grazing in the early morning in kind of a laid back way, the animals aren't looking up, there's no sign that they are nervous in any way, there's a good chance that there's no wolf in that area. So that might indicate, maybe it's time to pick up and move to another area. Another piece that's really helpful is that wolf pups are born in May and early June. And so that's a time when you know that wolves are going to be congregating near the den, and bringing food back to the den. So if the den happens to be near a easy access point, or with great views from trailheads or from the roadside in Yellowstone, then that can be a really great opportunity to give you a good shot at being able to see a wolf. You can also really help start to tap into the network of people who are watching wolves in Yellowstone National Park. So often the wolf researchers have radio telemetry programs and GPS collar programs that are helping them track wolves in Yellowstone National Park. And you can see their vehicles traveling around. If you travel with Natural Habitat Adventures, we have a radio that tunes in to their frequency so that we can listen to the conversation that's happening and get the latest information on wolf activity. But May and June can be a good time, early July, just because those are the times when the wolves are congregating. And if they're denning near those easy access places, that can give you a good chance to be able to set up for a photograph. So a couple considerations for how this plays into your photography. Number one, wolves are active early morning, late in the evening, and so there's low light conditions. In this picture here, this is actually a picture taken in the summer at dusk. You need to have a camera that's going to be able to handle pushing the ISO up so that you can shoot in lower light conditions. You also want to think about having a tripod to stabilize your camera, and having a fast lens. So that means a lens that has the ability to open up to a really wide aperture. When we think about wolves and how big of a landscape Yellowstone is, your lens can start to feel really short really fast. So the reality is that getting a really close-up image of a wolf is incredibly hard. It's more likely that you'll get a picture of a wolf within a landscape. But in this instance, the longer the lens, the better, kind of depending on how you're packing, and how much space you have, and your budget, obviously, as well. And then with wolf pups being born in early May or June, I would start to think about planning that photography trip or excursion in June as a good time. And making friends with rangers and making friends with other wildlife viewers can also increase your chances of being able to encounter a wolf in Yellowstone. So this particular time was, late April, early May. I was in Yellowstone with a group. And we were at a place that's pretty iconic, the hitching post, which is really just a roadside pull off. And we knew that there was a wolf den up the hill behind us. We hadn't seen the wolves yet. We'd been at the spot early morning, late afternoon, every day for the last 3 or 4 days. And then we got news that there was actually a carcass along the river. And sorry, my dog is barking in the background. He'll stop in a second. Jack, it's okay. So in this image, you can actually see in the center of the image, there are two wolves and a carcass. And so as we were watching this carcass, these wolves had made this kill overnight, and we hadn't seen them actually feeding at the carcass yet. But as the late evening approached, both of these wolves came out of the brush area and started feeding on this carcass. And because we had a really great relationship with the rangers in the area, we knew that these were two identified wolves. One of them was radio collared. 926F is her identifying number, and her mate, 925. And over the course of the evening, this right here is an image taken with a 300 millimeter lens. So you can tell, like, it's just not enough reach to be able to get a great image of a wolf. But we were loving, we had scopes, and we just got to spend some time watching wolves in their natural habitat. And we knew from having talked to rangers that they had recently given birth to pups just up the hill at their den site. And we were watching these two wolves take turns feeding on the carcass and go up to the den site to regurgitate and feed their pups. And in that process, as we were just staying in one place with our vehicles, watching the wolves, they moved very, very close by us. And just as sunset was approaching, so it was getting even darker, so it was pretty challenging conditions. And I was able to get, this image of 926F just sitting on the sagebrush as she watched her mate further down the hillside, feeding on that carcass. And the exact settings for this image, the shutter was 1/250, using a 300 millimeter lens. So the general rule of thumb for a crisp image is to double the length of your lens for your shutter speed. So this is actually a really slow shutter speed. And I was resting my lens on a rock to be able to get this, and just to stabilize a little bit more. So it was basically handheld, and as wide open, just about as wide open as the aperture would go, to be able to let as much light in as possible. And the ISO, I didn't write this down here, but the ISO was at 800. With this camera, Canon 5D, I was nervous about pushing the ISO too high because then you get grain in your image. But I was really proud of this shot. It was, you can actually see the radio collar that this wolf is wearing. You can see her golden eyes. It's not the epic wolf photography shots that you see some photographers have, but for someone who isn't solely focused on trying to get those portrait shots, this for me was a really exciting shot to be able to get. All right, so that story just kind of paints a picture of awareness of where that animal is going to be on the landscape, using as many resources as you can to learn about what the animals are doing specifically at that time of year, at that time of day, and then just there's an element of luck, of just being in the right place at the right time. So the next tip that I'd love to talk about is just how to use depth of field to your advantage. So in this previous example, I wasn't thinking too much of depth of field because I was pushed to the limit of my camera's ability to capture that image in pretty low light. So I already was pushing the shutter as slow as it could go, opening the aperture as wide as it could go, and I was as close to the animal as I could get safely without, I wasn't going to approach the animal. This was just the path the animal took to go past me up the hill. And so, there were limited variables to be creative with this shot, short of simply getting it. But when you have the opportunity, it's fun to be able to play with what is in focus and how much is in focus. And so in this image, we're looking at a macro shot of sagebrush. And to me, I was really trying to capture the furry texture of the leaf of a sagebrush. And so you can see the settings here. I had a really wide open aperture. And this was on a macro lens, so you can focus really, really closely to your subject. And it was in fairly low light. And so I had an ISO that was set at 400. But again, I was just trying to have a really shallow depth of field so that you had everything out of focus behind the subject. So your eye is just really drawn right to the leaf, so that I could talk about the pubescence that's on that leaf and how it provides thermal protection to the plant and helps it actually reduce evapotranspiration. So leaves have the ability to have a gas exchange so that they can go through the process of photosynthesis. But that comes at a cost in a really dry habitat. So in a place like Yellowstone that's really arid, this plant has adapted to be able to have these hairs on the surface of the leaf that as it warms up during the day, that creates this little boundary that insulates that leaf from the temperature of the air. And because it's a lower temperature, as it opens the openings in the leaf called the stomata to release the gas or exchange gas, it will not heat up as quickly. So at a lower temperature, you lose less water vapor. So it's an adaptation for really dry environments. And so I was able to tell that story because I took this picture, and I was able to isolate and get you to think just about that leaf, because I only had that little section in focus. Here's an example of a time when I wanted everything to be in focus. And this is a little bit of a misconception. A lot of folks, when you look at f-stop, so that's aperture, and that's the opening of a camera. So really low number like f2.8 is wide open, and that creates really shallow depth of field. So very few things are in focus. But as you stop that down to like an f16 or f22, which is really, really tiny, more and more and more of what's in front of the camera will be in focus. And so here I used an aperture of f9, and where I was going with that is I was on a tripod for this shot to stabilize because I had a shutter speed down to 1/30, which is pretty slow, especially with, it's a 28 millimeter lens. So again, the rule of thumb would be doing at least 1/50. So 1/30 is slow. You want a tripod. But f9 is important to highlight here because a lot of people believe that if you just increase that number as high as you can go with as small of an opening as possible, that you'll have the sharpest image. But a lot of research has been done on this, that f11, f16 is about as high as you want to go for the sharpest possible image, because you start to get diffraction when you get too small of an opening. So for those really sharp landscape shots where you want to just create everything in focus, shooting for more of an f9, f16, f11 is a better idea. So that's an example of just creating everything in focus. I wanted to have this kind of illusion where if I flip this image over, you might be disoriented enough that you're not sure which one is sky and which one is lake. This is actually up on the Teton Crest Trail in the Tetons. Beautiful backcountry campsite. And here is an example of how your distance from an object or from the subject is going to influence what's in focus. So if you're really close to the subject, as I am in this image of the pronghorn on the left here, the background is going to go really out of focus with a wide open aperture. So this was basically as wide open as I could go on this 300 millimeter lens. And the pronghorn's in focus. A little bit of the sagebrush right on that plane next to the pronghorn is in focus, but then everything is out of focus. And I really wanted that because I think it really draws you in to the personality of the animal, and you just start really observing the sharpness of the eye and the horns. And then on this image of a mule deer, I have the same exact lens on, it's the same aperture, but you're noticing that the background is slightly more in focus. There's more detail in the background than you have in the pronghorn image. And that's because the subject, the deer, is further in the distance from me. So more of the image is going to be in focus. So that's just another aspect that you can use. Like if you're not photographing wildlife, say you're photographing a leaf and you have the ability to get really close or really far away from that leaf, just play around a little bit. Keep all of the settings the same, but then give yourself some distance from that leaf or get really close to that leaf and see how it changes the way the camera reads the background. And you might find that you really like the softness that comes from really a blurred background with bokeh. Or you might like having a little bit more detail in the background. And so this I thought put that into focus here on these two images. And then I'm really drawn to wildlife portraits that just really isolate the animal from the background, um, kind of like the photo arc images that you see sometimes. And this raven was just incredibly friendly. It was just really close. It was on a rock right next to me, and it just let me take a lot of images, and which was really fun. But here you can see I'm using a 300 millimeter lens, pretty wide open aperture because I wanted to create a completely blurred background. And then I felt like it was taking it a step further. This image kind of lent itself to being black and white, just because to me, it just emphasizes the crisp clarity of the raven itself and kind of that shiny texture of its wings versus the kind of soft background here. Now, the tripod. This one is kind of a constant battle that I have of should I bring it or should I leave it? And this isn't really a discussion of all the different types of tripods that you can get. There's so many options out there, and that's a really personal choice. But for me, I'm often leaving the tripod behind. But I'll talk about the instances when it's really important to have it. So with wildlife photography, the moment can be so fast, the moment that you really want to capture. And often a tripod is just cumbersome, it gets in the way. Sometimes a monopod with a swinging sling can be really helpful because you can move the camera around really quickly but still get some stability. But I find getting next to a tree and holding the camera against the tree, or laying down on the ground like I am here, because I love that angle, can be really, really helpful. Now, another thing I'll point out here, just as we're looking at this image, this was taken with, oh gosh, I wrote down the wrong number here. It's not an 8,000 millimeter. Oh no, that's right. That's ISO 8,000. So this was taken with an 800 millimeter that Nikon had sent me to test out. I don't own that lens. It's a little too rich for my blood. But the encouraging thing is that before I had gotten to use a lens of that length, I'd always been so envious of photographers who have these huge lenses. And I always felt like, gosh, if I only had one, I'd be taking incredible photos. And I'm happy to report that it's only half true. Even with an 800 millimeter, it's still challenging to get really good wildlife portraits. And it all comes back to that first point of know your wildlife and be patient and spend the time. But with this image in particular, this is a gray fox taken in my backyard here in Adirondack Park. And I just was able to grab my camera really quickly and lay down, and I knew this fox was probably going to move through a certain path, and it did, and it stopped, and I took a couple pictures, but there was no time for a tripod. And often that's going to be the case. Even if you're carrying your tripod with you, there are very few instances where you've got time to be able to rig everything up to be able to get a great wildlife portrait. So you have to be ready to be able to adjust your settings quickly for the conditions. So in this instance, I'm using a really high ISO. For me, at least, that's high with 8,000. Wide open aperture at 6.3, and then a pretty fast shutter because I'm hand holding. So I'm following that rule of doubling the length of the lens with a shutter of 1/1600. And so this shot I was really proud of, and then this shot I was really excited about getting those blue eyes in focus. I would have loved a little bit more light here. It was a little bit backlit, and I had to use some post editing to be able to open up the shadows in the eyes to be able to get that color. But that was my objective on this shot, was to be able to capture the blue eyes of that gray fox. And you can see here it's mostly the same settings, but I did bump the ISO up to 1600. And so again, it's always that trade-off with, if you bump the ISO up, you can have a faster shutter speed. But if you bump up the ISO too much, you start to get noise in your image. But that's becoming less and less of a problem with this camera. With the Z8, it has much less noise than if I was trying to do the same shot with a lot of the same types of equipment as on the Canon that I used to have, the 5D. So here's an instance where I did have a tripod, and it did help me quite a bit. So this is shooting with a 400 millimeter. This is a great crested flycatcher, and this was really exciting. I was on a photo assignment for a land conservation group in an old growth forest, trying to tell stories about wildlife that you find in an old growth forest that you don't find anywhere else. And there was a 1-day assignment, and I was really excited because I was able to find a great crested flycatcher nest. So when you find something like a nest that's active, that's when you should be thinking, I need to get the tripod out, because you're going to have a lot of time to observe that animal, especially with an active nest where parents are feeding the young. Time all of a sudden doesn't matter as much. So you get the tripod out, you get everything set up properly, and then that opens up a new opportunity, because a lot of photographers now, it's also expected that you have really great videos. And so when you're on a tripod, you can also switch over to video mode. We won't talk about that too much, but that's a huge advantage, and one of the big reasons why I carry a tripod in the field is to be able to switch over and get some video to be able to show the context of that place. But on this shot, this situation happened really, really quickly. And one thing that I would change is drop that f-stop. So right here, it's at f14. There's no reason at why it needed to be there. But this moment in particular happened so quickly that I didn't change that in time. So I could have bumped the shutter speed up. I could have done any number of things to improve the quality of this image. But overall, I was really happy with this shot. Here's another example of a great time to use tripods. It's absolutely essential if you're trying to do night sky photography. And in this shot on the left, these are both the same pond, so Mackenzie Pond, really close by, just a couple miles from my house. And on the left, we have the Milky Way, and this is actually a stack of 20 images. So one of the things that you can do if you have to bump your ISO, and it's just a landscape shot, you can take multiple exposures and then stack them in post-production, and that helps remove any noise, especially from a night sky. This image, there is a federal prison that's creating that really bright blue glow to the left and bottom of the Milky Way. Let's see. So another couple things to highlight here is the shutter speed is 10 seconds. That's about as long as you can go if you're wanting to get pinprick stars instead of star trails. So then from there, I build out all of the rest of the settings. On the right-hand side, I wanted a fast enough shutter to be able to really create a crisp image in the water in case there was any movement in the water. It was a very, very still fall day, really gorgeous fall color that day. And here I'm using a 35 millimeter prime lens. A lot of the lenses I use are prime because they allow you to get a faster lens, opens up to a larger aperture, and the image quality is just generally crisper. It does mean that you have less flexibility in terms of carrying things in the field. But then again, keeping the ISO really low on this image and having it on a tripod just really stabilized and made sure that this was a really, really crisp image on the right here. All right. So this one is a constant struggle for me, bringing and leaving behind the right gear. You know the adage, if you leave your camera at home, that's when you're going to have all of the best wildlife photography moments. But with that said, there are times when you're going to want to bring all of your gear because you think there's a good shot that you're going to need all of it. But what I tend to do is that I get a little bit burned out if every single adventure I'm going on is carrying equipment. So I'll choose, okay, today I'm interested in macro photography and I'm going to bring my macro lens and nothing else, just to have a light load, enjoy what I'm doing other than that, whether it's fishing or hiking, and then have the equipment there to be able to get something if I want to. And I would do that. This particular shot, I was out fishing in the winter on the Snake River in Grand Teton National Park. And the only thing I brought was my 300 millimeter. And I said, hopefully I'll see a moose. And I got lucky this time. So this bull moose was moving through pretty quickly through the riparian area. And so I think that's my biggest tip. And then the other tip for like what to bring and what not to bring is really plan out your shot and triage. Because for me, it's unreasonable to bring all of my gear all the time. I'd have a huge backpack and you just have to choose sometimes. So if I know I'm going to go and photograph this bird, this is the gray jay, also called the camp robber. I know that these birds are very inquisitive and friendly, and I don't need a long lens to be able to photograph them. So if I'm just going to spend some time with them, I'll just bring a light lens. So this time I brought a 24 to 70 millimeter and got some great portraits of this bird, because if you stand in a boggy area in the early spring, these birds will come over and just check you out to see what you have going on. And if you have a couple of cranberries or peanuts, they'll be your friend forever. So you just want to cater your trip or your outing and really think about what photographs you want to get. If you want to just get landscapes, then just bring a 50 millimeter or a 24 millimeter. My biggest advice for traveling, a lot of people want a wide open lens. Maybe I'd be tempted to bring my 20 millimeter on a trip like this to Iceland. But instead, I know that I have the ability to take 5 images just like that, stabilize, take an image, move a little bit, take an image, move, take an image. You don't even need a tripod. Lock the exposure, all of the settings in the same exact place, and then stitch them together in post to be able to create a panoramic image. So that's been a really great strategy where I can pack fewer lenses, but I can still get this shot at this location. The next topic here is don't get stuck in your favorite settings. And I'm definitely someone who falls into this, because my go-to mode when I'm going out to photograph anything is I set my camera to aperture priority. So I'm choosing the aperture only and everything else is automatic. I make sure that the shutter isn't too slow, and then I protect the highlights. So what that means is if I know that an image has a lot of white, like if I'm capturing a snowy landscape, I'll just grab the button right next to the shutter and I'll drop the exposure down a couple notches, and then I have the settings I need for that photo shoot. If I'm starting to realize that maybe the camera is overexposing or underexposing, and I need to go into manual settings, I will. But for the vast majority of my work, this is how I shoot. It just gets me to the right place most of the time, and then I customize from there. But it's really important not to get stuck doing that, and you can fall into kind of just shooting the same types of images all the time. So I like to challenge, like, one of my favorite things to do is to take a telephoto lens and to shoot mountains. Like, a lot of times you're using a 50 millimeter or 24 millimeter to shoot landscapes. But this shot I really love because I was using my 300 millimeter. I had the aperture really wide open, which you don't usually see in landscape photography. Pretty fast shutter speed because I was hand stabilizing this, and then bumped the ISO up enough to be able to get the shot. And if I had used a 50 millimeter, I just don't think that the light coming across the ridge in the Beartooth Mountains on the northwest entrance of the Yellowstone National Park, I don't think you would get the same quality of light and the way that it feels there to see that. So this image was me just kind of using the lens that I was using to capture some images of bison and just pointing it at something different. So always kind of trying to do step out of your comfort zone. And I think it's really important to have like an inquisitive mindset when you're photographing things. So here I was trying to capture water moving underneath this ice flow on a river. And on the left, I'm really, really close to the ice, and the aperture, it's at f11. Shutter speed is 1/50, and I'm using a 100 millimeter lens. So it really creates that crisp ice detail, but then the water is you can see the motion in the water, and it's a little bit out of focus. On the right hand image, I'm a little bit further away from the ice. uh, I've changed the shutter to be much faster so it would freeze motion in the water. And the focus is still on the ice, but the water is a bit more in focus. You're starting to see the rocks beneath the water. So just, neither one of these images are going to win any awards, but I just like the idea of trying to play with the settings, play with composition. And I think that's, like, in some ways the biggest tip that I can offer for photography is just to never lose sight of that inquisitive nature, of that playfulness. Try and picture what it was like having a camera in your hand for the first time, and go and have that same curiosity about the world now. The next one, and this one's really important for, like, if you're hoping to tell a story of an animal, or bring back photos that really speak to the whole trip that you went on, is making sure that you're not pointing your camera at all the expected stuff. Uh, so on this particular outing, I saw this indigo bunting that's on the bottom frame, and I was really trying to get great pictures of that. But then all these really early spring aspen leaves were just really beautiful in this light, and so I spent most of my time not really chasing that bird, and I never got a great photograph of it. But I, really enjoyed focusing in on the aspen leaf and then trying to get some broader landscape shots. And together it starts to tell an interesting story of the ecology of that place. In this instance, I was fishing a river and had my camera gear, and came across a sandhill crane that was going through the behaviors that they have when they are nesting and they want to draw you away from the nesting site. So I quickly grabbed some photos as I was moving away, and this bird kind of followed me for a couple hundred meters into the sagebrush flats. And so this kind of series of photos is me walking away, and this bird kind of following me and trying to draw me further and further away from its nest. And they use their wings to kind of draw them down along the ground, and they shuffle the wings along and make noises. They call really loud. They have this trumpet that they do. That's a really neat call. And so it was calling, and then its mate was calling, and I was moving away respectfully from the nest, and it just kept moving along with me and making sure that I wasn't coming back to the nest site. And eventually that sandhill crane flew back to where it was nesting. And so, not just capturing the one image that's kind of the portrait of the animal, but also showing where is that animal living in the sagebrush near these aspens, this aspen stand, and ultimately flying over this landscape. Another example of this is, so these are pictures from visiting the wintering grounds of the monarch butterfly. They complete this 4,000-mile journey to be able to go to this one very specific place in the high elevation mountains of Michoacan, Mexico. And when you get there, it's fairly overwhelming. There's so much to see. This is kind of the landscape that you see through the window of trees, and all those little dots in the frame are actually monarch butterflies. And so just trying to capture the close-ups, the dramatic scenery, as well as the various different moments that are made possible by the weather. And I'm looking at the clock and realizing that my presentation is a little bit long. So I'm going to cruise through this a little bit quickly to save some time for questions here at the end. Next one, practice makes perfect. You know, I'm working on this Northern Peatlands project, and I'm capturing the same exact location over and over and over to see how it changes through the seasons. And I'm using different compositions. This is one particular composition from summer to fall to late fall. And then trying to get close up to all the wildlife and plants that you find in these ecosystems, and then some distance landscape shots. And it's just, you'll never photography is something that you can never get to the end of, to the bottom of. You can always find more ways to capture a particular place. And so this is my big project that I'm returning to week after week, month after month, to be able to see what this place is like through the seasons and be able to, inspire conservation of these areas. That other tip, put the camera down, that's it. I don't have slides related to this, but sometimes you have to put the camera down to really get to know a place, and then that can give you new insights into other compositions or photos that you might take. And just a reminder that you're not there just for the image. Every edit counts. Post-production is really important. I'll just show you the transformation this photo can have. The raw photo, it's great, but it's a little flat. Maybe it bothers me that the horizon is a little bit tilted. So then I just punched it in, brought the highlights down. Here are my edits. Bringing the highlights down, exposure down just a smidge, shadows, open them up a little bit, adjust the white and black point, and bring in a little bit of vibrance and saturation. My last tip before we go to a Q&A is just to learn from the pros. There are so many talented photographers. Find them, search for your type of photography, or even the genre of photography or the place where you're photographing, and see how other people are photographing it. One person that I really love to follow is Jaime Rojo. He's got fantastic images of monarch butterflies, and just gets me thinking differently about how I approach photographing that place. Another person to watch for is Bertie Gregory. Just does some phenomenal wildlife photography, and his big number one photography tip is to really understand the ecology and know your wildlife. And then that's such a leaping point to be able to get into great photographs. So that's the laundry list of tips. And if you're interested in tuning in to a couple more talks, July 16th, August 1st, and August 15th are my next Daily Dose chats. And I have an artist talk in person at the View Arts Center, where I've got my Northern Peatlands work on display from 6 to 7 p.m. Next Thursday. And if you'd like to follow along on this project, you can scan that QR code and take a look at some of the storytelling that I've been doing. These peatlands are essential for preservation of biodiversity and also in addressing climate change. So feel free to get in touch with me. Shoot me an email if you have questions. I know I didn't leave a ton of time here to be able to answer, but I'd love to take a few minutes to answer some questions. So thanks for tuning in.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. All right, before we get into the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. So let's get to some of these questions. So let's go back to that monarch picture in the sunshine. Could you tell us what your settings were for that one again?
Ooh, I didn't write down these settings, but I can take a good guess for this one. I had really good light. I was using the 70 millimeter at this point, and I was using a shallow depth of field. So then after that, it was just how I set the ISO to compensate for the lighting. But this was a really shallow depth of field. As long as that's the image you're speaking about, I can go back here. There's the full version of it. Yeah, so I believe those were this. I'd have to go back to that particular image, but yeah, great question.
All right, thank you so much. So, what format do you prefer for your storage, for your archiving your images? JPEG, TIFF, RAW?
Yeah, so for me, I keep all my so I when I import all the photos from a shoot, I'll go through and start to select the ones that I like by starring them and sorting by that. And once I confirm those selections, I'll go back and the ones that I didn't star, I'll delete entirely, which is a little bit rare. Some people hold on to everything. And then from there, I keep those RAWs in one storage location and then I export JPEGs or differing file formats depending on what I'm doing with them and depending on the client's needs. So JPEG typically does the job for the final edit for most applications. If I'm printing large format, then I'm considering TIFF. But beyond that, that's kind of my rough filing system without going into huge detail.
Great, thank you. For low light conditions, what would you recommend as a good lens setting?
For low light conditions, basically what I'm trying to do is follow that rule of thumb. So if my lens is 50 millimeters, then handheld, the slowest speed I'm going to go is 100, 1/100. And then from there, you just figure out what you need to get there, right? So then it's setting your ISO to be able to make those settings work. And then it's kind of creative as well because maybe you want a shallow depth of field, so then you're selecting a really wide open aperture that also lets in a lot of light. Or maybe you're trying to have more things in focus, so you're stopping that down, which means you'll probably need to bump the ISO. You just have to be familiar with those different categories so that you know how to adjust them when you need to. Because the automatic or the aperture priority settings in your camera do a really great job, but occasionally in those low light conditions, you want to be able to manipulate. And often, what I'll do is I'll try it a bunch of ways. I'll try it with a low shutter speed, even if I'm worried about a little bit of hand movement. Um, and then I'll try it with a really high ISO, medium ISO, and then a low ISO with different conditions. So again, just kind of being playful and iterative in your process.
Great, thank you. So, one of our guests has been using Lightroom for quite some time, and lately there are some new AI tools like Topaz and DxO. Do you have any thoughts on these to reduce noise or increase sharpness and focus?
My feeling, I occasionally will use Topaz, but the real reason why I'm using it is if I'm going to be printing something really large, and I prefer their upscaling software. Um, I think the in-house denoise feature that Lightroom has does a great job. I don't really see the need to pay for another service, but if you are printing really large images and want to upscale, there are some good additional products out there. Or if you're doing a lot of image stacking, there are some specialized programs for that. So that it's kind of an endless pit, but I find that Lightroom does a really good job, and occasionally getting into Photoshop, occasionally getting into Topaz. Yeah, thank you.
So, if I'm pretty new to photography and I haven't taken a lot of shots of wildlife or of nature, is there anything you can recommend that I do before I head out on a NatHab trip to prepare?
Oh, absolutely. Uh, Find, a park with squirrels, practice on anything that you can, whether it's your dog in your backyard, a squirrel in your backyard, leaves. Try and find something that moves to play around with all of these things. Do it early in the day with low light, do it in the middle of the day when it's really bright. Just test a bunch of things out, even if you don't care about the images, just to get your hands on that camera and familiar with it, because the last thing you want to be doing is figuring out your camera when something really cool is happening on a trip.
So, what if I just don't have an expensive camera? What if I just have my iPhone? Can I still get some good shots?
Absolutely. Phones are have come so far in their ability to capture images. Occasionally, you can shoot in RAW format with your phones. So you could look that up to see whether or not that's something you're interested in. But that really requires some editing afterwards. But phones take incredible pictures. There could be, and there are, a lot of tutorials for how to maximize your phone, and often that is the camera that I'll be carrying. And I have a lot of images that I'm really proud of that have just come from my phone. So it's, a very powerful tool these days.
Great. Thanks for all the great advice, Charlie. Unfortunately, that will be the last question that we do have time for today. So I would like to throw it back to you for some closing comments.
Well, thank you all so much for tuning in. And if you have other questions about gear or camera settings, feel free to email me and reach out. And you can follow me on Instagram and see what I'm up to in the field. But thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you soon.
Charlie, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. So if you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.